Well, if you have your glasses, put them on. If you have your hearing aids, turn them up. If you got your teeth, keep them in. And if you got your Bibles, open them to Genesis chapter 16. We're in a sermon series on Sunday night. When godly men, when godly people make worldly decisions. And we're seeing the consequences. We're free to choose, but we're not free to choose consequences. Therefore, we need to be very careful what we decide, because what we decide is often going to determine how the outcome is. Tonight, Abraham and Hagar. Genesis 16, the first 6 verses. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abraham, "See now, the Lord has restrained me. He has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abraham heeded the voice of Sarah. Verse 3. Then Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife. And Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarah said to Abraham, "My wrong is upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord be the judge between you and me." Verse 6. So Abraham said to Sarah, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarah dealt harshly with her, Hagar fled from her presence. Like most Bible stories, this story is profoundly simple, but simply profound. So let me tell you the story if I can, and then we'll make some observations from what is in the Bible. The Lord has promised Abraham He will give him a son. This son will come from Abraham's own seed, and it will come through Abraham's wife, Sarah. God has promised this to Abraham over and over and over again. Repeatedly, He has said this to Abraham. Abraham goes home as God reminds him of this promise, and he reminds his wife Sarah of this promise, and she becomes furious with him. He got her mad. She flew off the handle, and when you fly off the handle, you normally don't have a good landing. She says to Abraham, "Abraham, you look at me. I'm too old to have children. Quit this foolish talk. Quit this babbling of what God's going to do. Go to the servant Hagar and let her give you a son. Now get gone and do as I've told you." That was a nice conversation, was it not? And Abraham's answer to his wife, "Yes, dear, whatever you say." And that's exactly what he did. You see, Sarah is angry with God. She's angry with Abraham. And she's going to become angry with Hagar. She's angry with God because He speaks to Abraham and doesn't speak to her. Yes, you heard me correctly. God did business with Abraham. He was the head of the home. He wasn't slighting Sarah at all. She was Abraham's equal. But God dealt with Abraham. He was the head of the home. And God made the promises to Abraham, but they included Sarah. But she's angry with God. Why don't God tell this to me? Why do you keep being his lapdog coming to me with his messages? She's angry with God. She's angry with Abraham because he believes what she believes. She believes that he believes that what God's saying is true, and she don't believe it's true. Abraham, do you really believe these promises that God keeps making but God doesn't deliver on? Why don't you challenge God? Why don't you question God? Why don't you rebuke God when he keeps telling you this? It hasn't happened. And then she becomes angry with Hagar because she believes that Hagar's making a move on her man. And by the way, she's the one who told Abraham to do it. So Hagar becomes pregnant. Sarah blames Abraham for the whole affair and tells Abraham to fix it. Abraham, being the man that he was, said, "Honey, whatever you want to do is fine with me." And Sarah runs Hagar off, a pregnant Hagar off, into the wilderness to die, possibly. Now God will intervene. He'll save Hagar. He'll save the unborn child. He'll send her back to Sarah. And there for the next 13 years, Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar will all live together. Talk about friction. Talk about tension. Talk about contention. That's what Abraham's going to live with, having these two women involved in his life for the next 13 years. That's the story. Some of you men are saying, "I'm sure glad I wasn't Abraham." Well, what can we learn from all of this? What can we learn? Well, I think first of all we see from this story that unbelief can make a brave man into a coward. Unbelief can make a brave man into a coward. When Abraham was with the Lord, when he looked at the Lord and listened to the Lord, he had great faith. When Abraham was with Sarah, his wife, he was intimidated by her. And his faith dissipated into doubt and even unbelief as she challenged what God was saying to him. Now, Abraham knew what God had said to him. He believed what God said to him. But when Sarah attacked his faith, when Sarah attacked his beliefs, Abraham folded up like a cheap lawn chair in a hurricane. This brave warrior who was not afraid to take on pagan kings wimped out when it came to taking on his wife. Sarah, for whatever reason, did not have the faith of Abraham. She did not have the confidence in God that Abraham had. She didn't believe that God could do what God said he was going to do. And she became an obstacle in her husband's faith. And Abraham did not stand up to her. And therefore, the household was divided. Not because it was a Clemson, Carolina household, but it was a household of faith and a household of unbelief. Let me give you a formula. Unbelief leads to fear. Fear leads to sin. Sin leads to stress and strife. And stress and strife leads to a miserable life. That's why the Bible constantly says we need to be united. We need to be in harmony on important things. Because when you have division in important things, primary things, spiritual matters, you are going to have a great deal of conflict. And for 13 years, Abraham was going to have to listen back and forth to what was taking place and referee most of the time. So, unbelief can make a brave man into a coward. particularly when he's confronted by somebody in his own household over it. Secondly, another truth I see here. God always keeps His word, but not always in our way and in our time. God promised Abraham 4 things. First of all, Abraham, I am going to give you a people that will be so large, so great, so innumerable, they will be like the stars in the sky. Abraham, I'm going to give you a people. Abraham, I'm going to give you a land that will encompass almost the entire Middle East. It's yours. I'm going to give you a people. I'm going to give you a land to put those people on. I'm going to send the Messiah through you. There is a Messiah who's going to come. And He will come through you. He will be the son of Abraham. And I, Abraham, am going to give you a son from your own seed, a son through your own wife, Sarah, that will allow every other promise to transpire. The birth of the son I'm going to give you will give you the people. The birth of the son that I will give you the land. The birth of the son that I will give you will bring forth the Messiah. And it will all start with the son. And Abraham said, when? And God said, later. Abraham said, how? God said, by my power. Abraham said, who, what, where? And God said, don't you worry about it. I've got it under control. You see, Abraham, like us, believed that when God says something, He's supposed to do it 5 minutes after He says it, or 5 days after He says it, or 5 weeks after He says it. We don't like the wait. We're a microwave generation. We don't slow cook anything anymore. And when it comes to God, we sometimes try to force Him into that way of thinking. Abraham said, Lord, thank you for giving me people. Thank you for giving me land. Thank you that the Messiah will come through my line. Thank you for giving me a son one day. And Lord, if you don't mind, could I have them all right now? And Sarah was basically the same way. She didn't believe what God said because God didn't do it just like that. But understand, ladies and gentlemen, God says wait a lot. Wait. Because God does multiple things at one time. He's not just doing something for you. But basically, when He's doing something for you and me, He's also doing something for a lot of other people too. And He's tying everything together. God is not a God of time. Time is irrelevant to God. But timing is very important to God. Jesus came into the world, the Bible says, in the fullness of time. When the timing was right, God brought forth His Son. When the timing is right, God will bring forth His promises. And we have to understand that. A perfect God always wants to bring things at a perfect time, and He does. Yet we want it right now. And if He doesn't give it to us right now, we pout, we sulk, we doubt, we unbelieve, and sometimes we run off and leave Him. Principle number 3. Avoiding doubt and unbelief is helped when we avoid skeptics and scoffers. Now, I realize that Abraham is married to Sarah, so he's got to be with her to some degree. But by and large, ladies and gentlemen, we need to watch who we keep company with. Because who we keep company with in many ways will determine the amount of faith that we have, the amount of confidence that we have in what God said God will do. In Psalm 1, listen to what the psalmist says about keeping the right company. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. Blessed is the man who does not stand in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Blessed is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on this law he meditates day and night. You show me who you hang around with. Show me with who you associate with. Show me who you run with, and I'll show you who you are. Men of great faith, they associate themselves with men of great faith. Men who are giants for God, they walk with giants of God. Men who do anything great for God, mighty for God, productive for God, they'll always be surrounded by such people. That's why the psalmist says, pick your company wisely. Pick your associates wisely. Pick those that you listen to and hang around with wisely, because they're going to shape who you are. And Sarah was a drag on Abraham. But she was his wife. And he prayed for her and he tried to work with her. But in matters outside of your spouse, you need to make sure that the people you allow into your life are going to increase your godliness, not lessen it. Increase your faith, not decrease it. Always make sure you're with the right people, and you'll always be in the right direction. Another principle we see here is faith keeps its eyes on God. I'd like to submit to you tonight, when Abraham looked at the situations and circumstances, when he surveyed what was going on, he saw God. Not just God, he saw an awesome God. It's amazing how two people can look at the same thing and yet see something differently. Abraham looked and he saw God. Sarah looked and she saw herself. When Abraham listened, he listened to God. When Sarah listened, she listened to these doubters. When Abraham looked at the situation, he saw God in it. When Sarah looked at the situation, she didn't see nothing but the situation. Abraham wasn't concerned about the odds. He wasn't concerned about the percentages. He wasn't concerned about what Las Vegas said. He wasn't concerned about the averages. But when Sarah looked at things, she said, well, what's the chance of this? What's the chance of that? What would the experts say? Where would the gamblers put their money on? That's kind of the way I need to position myself, she would say. You see, faith sees God. And people who have doubts and unbelief, they never see God. And Abraham saw, and he saw God. Abraham saw, and she saw no God. You see, Sarah saw herself in all of this. God had promised that she was going to be the mother of Abraham's son. She would bring Abraham's son into the world. And she got in front of the mirror and she said, that ain't going to happen. She let the mirror speak for her. Ain't going to happen. I can't have a child. I can't. And then she listened to the doubters. I don't believe Sarah just came up with all of this stuff by herself. I think she got wound with a group of ladies. And they talked about things like this. The possibility of her having a baby at her age. The possibility of this, the possibility of that. And I believe she sat down with skeptics and scoffers and scorners and sarcastics. And she listened to them. And she listened to them more than she would listen to her husband or even God. And they told her, not only you can't do it, Sarah, but your God can't do it. Do you realize what you're asking of your God? That's impossible. And then she probably went to her medical doctor, said, Doc, what do you think? He said, you got to be kidding. You see, she did not see things. She did not hear things. She did not experience things through faith. And Abraham did. She said, I can't, God can't, it can't. And Abraham said, God can. What's impossible for man, help me out, is possible with God. You know, whenever you look at faith, you know all faith is? We always try to muddy the waters and make things complex. Faith is not complex. God has said it. I believe it. And I, by my own free will act upon it. That's faith. That's all it is. God's spoken, and I believe. I believe that God will do what He says. I believe that God will do what He says in His time and in His way, but He will do it. And when He tells me to act upon it, I will act upon it. It's not for me to reason. It's not for me to figure out. It's not for me to argue. It's not for me to debate. It's just for me to obey. That's the way it's always been. When Moses stood at the Red Sea, this uncrossable sea, he remembered what God had said. You get my people to the Red Sea, and I will get you across. Did Moses know how God was going to do this? No, he didn't. But he knew that God would do it. And they waited till God rolled back the mighty waters of the Red Sea, and then they crossed dry shod to the other side, and then God collapsed the mighty waters of the Red Sea and drowned the greatest army of that day, the Egyptian army. But Moses knew what God told him to do. David saw God when he went out to face Goliath. Most people saw a giant that was too big to hit. David saw a giant that was too big to miss. Everybody saw this human tank called Goliath, but David saw God. And God was bigger than Goliath. So this unbeatable giant, David knew he was going to slay him. Did David know how he was going to work it out? No, but he knew that he was going to be the king of Israel. Therefore, this giant was not going to kill him, or God would have lied to him. So Moses saw God. He didn't see the uncrossable Red Sea. David saw God. He didn't see an unbeatable giant. Elijah saw God. He didn't see hundreds of false prophets standing in his way. All Elijah knew is God said, you go confront those false prophets. You challenge them in the name of Yahweh. And I'm sure Elijah's thinking to himself, I'm just one, they're 800 plus. But God said, challenge them, and God will deliver. Did Elijah understand how it was going to work out? No, God don't share the plan. He just says, trust the man. That's him. Do you think Joshua understood how Jericho, the impenetrable fortress, was going to be brought down? You see, we have the privilege of looking back. They didn't have that privilege. Joshua's a military man. And yet God says to him, attack this fortress. It's yours. You're not going to lose one single man. I'm going to give you this fortress. I'm going to wipe out the enemy. I'm going to give you their spoils. Do you think that Joshua understood it? Do you think he comprehended how a marching band was going to beat that city and those soldiers? No, he didn't. He just knew what God said. Gideon, he faced 135,000 Midianites. God said, pare your army down to 300 and go attack them. And by the way, you won't need no weapons. Bring your instruments. And so Gideon, with 300 soldiers, most of them band members, attacks the Midianites. Now, let me ask you a question. If you were a betting people, and I know you guys don't bet. Some of you don't. Who would you bet on? Be honest. Don't look out here like me like you're spiritual giants. 300 Israelis, most of them band members, led by Gideon, a nobody, against 135,000 of the finest Midianite troops. You've got $100. Where are you putting your money? I thought the Midianites. And quite frankly, Gideon would have too, except God spoke to him. Do what I tell you, and you'll win. Did Gideon know what God was up to? No, but he knew he'd win. Peter had his eyes on the Lord when he stepped out of that boat and did what? He walked on water. We like to criticize Peter because he didn't walk on water long. How long would you have walked? Me and you probably would have stepped out and went straight to the bottom. Peter had enough faith to know that the Master beckoned him to come. How he was going to walk on water, the Lord didn't tell him. Just walk on the water. And he actually walked on the water. How many steps? I don't know. But he walked on the water. So what am I saying to you when we talk about Moses and David and Elijah and Joshua and Gideon and Peter? And we could go on and on and on. They all believed what God said. And what God said, they acted upon with the information that was given to them by God. And Abraham, he didn't understand how a man his age could impregnate his wife at her age. He didn't understand how God could guarantee it would be a son. He didn't understand all of that. He just knew that this is what he was supposed to do, and he wanted to do it. Where Sarah didn't understand it, and she dismissed it because she couldn't understand it. Why do godly men make bad decisions sometimes? Well, because they get pressure from places that they never thought, from people they didn't think. And sometimes they make these decisions, and remember, every time you make a choice, the consequence is yours. So be careful what you choose. Abraham made the wrong choice. He caved in to Sarah. And for the next 13 years, he would have 2 women under his roof, back and forth. As we're going to see later, God settled it all when he gave him Isaac. Heads are bowed and eyes are closed.